Okay. Welcome to our program this afternoon, COVID-19, Where Are We Now? With Dr. George Rutherford. I am Laurel Plimier. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and we're excited to have you back here on Zoom and on YouTube after a brief hiatus over the summer. And thank you for coming and joining us and spending some time this afternoon. Before we get started with the introduction of our speaker, I wanted to go over a few logistics. So if you're on the Zoom call with us, you should remain muted. And I think I need to request you to unmute in order for you to unmute yourself. But if you accidentally do unmute yourself, you may pop up on our YouTube live stream, which you may not be happy about. So you can post your questions for Dr. Rutherford now or at any time during the presentation, either in the Zoom chat or in the comments on the YouTube live stream. And I will ask as many of them as I can during the last half of the program. If you are joining us on YouTube, I request that you subscribe to our channel, and if you click the notification bell, you can get notifications of future live stream events. And for advance notice for future events, please join our mailing list, which you can do on our website, which is www.lwvpiedmont.org. And you can also join the League on our website. Your membership supports both the grassroots efforts of the League locally and at the state and national levels. And our efforts in voter education and advocacy is extremely important work right now and for the foreseeable future. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jennifer Trainer, who is our program committee co-chair, and she will introduce today's program.
Thanks, Laurel. We are honored to have Dr. George Rutherford join us for the third time since COVID started. He's been our most popular speaker in the last year and a half. And as you all probably know, those of you who have seen him speak before, he is a global expert on public health and on COVID. Dr. Rutherford's the director of the Institute for Global Health at UCSF, as well as the head of the Division of Preventive Medicine and Public Health. In addition, he also has appointments as professor of pediatrics and of family and community medicine at UC Berkeley. As everyone here, I'm sure, is well aware, Dr. Rutherford has played a leading role in California's COVID response. He has a number of publications and two ones that might be of interest to the group. One is, Will Coronavirus Disease 2019 Become Seasonal? Which I think is something we're all wondering about. And also estimation of the effects of contact tracing and mask adoption on COVID-19 transmission in San Francisco, another hot topic. Dr. Rutherford was educated at Stanford and Duke University School of Medicine. He's board certified in pediatrics and in general preventative medicine and public health. We really appreciate your time, Dr. Rutherford. We know how busy you are, and thank you for fitting us into your schedule, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, allow me to say it's always a pleasure, and I'm delighted to be here. And so, without further ado, what I thought we'd talk about today, this is what Jennifer asked me, was talk a little bit about the current epidemiology of COVID-19, a little bit about the biology of variants, and we're not going to get into amino acid sequences, don't worry. Well, we will a little bit. And Delta in particular, talk a little bit about vaccinations and boosters, and then schools, and then keeping safe in the era of the Delta variant. So here's where we are in the world. There have been 225 million reported cases. This probably represents something closer to 750 million cases in the world. And you can see that we've gone through these various waves. This is the most recent wave, which has been largely in the Americas, which is North and South America, and in Europe. these are WHO regions, which is why the Americas are lumped together. And you can see the Africa in blue, the Western Pacific, which is China, largely, have been relatively less affected. But here, if you look across this is by population. So Malaysia's had a kind of a tough time. Here's the US, Turkey, Thailand, Philippines, and India, which had this horrible outbreak, has dropped back down. If you look across everybody, these are how many cases there were in the last week, with the US, the UK, India, Iran, Turkey, and then other countries down here. Brazil has had a lot of disease, and they're starting finally to come back down. This is where the cases are occurring, and this is per population. So this is reported cases in the last 7 days per 100,000 population. So if you have 300 cases per 100,000 over the last 7 days, that's the dark one. The US, the Guianas, Britain, Mongolia, Malaysia, as I said earlier. But then there are these ones that are between 100 and 300, which are the swath through Southwest Asia, and down here in Botswana, West France, and I think it's the Netherlands, Austria, and the Baltics, and Belarus and Norway. But and then also in Southeast Asia. But you can see how this is really kind of changes. This map changes all the time. China has done remarkably well, and has done since their earliest outbreak periods, and that's because they're not they don't mess around when they're cases, to put it mildly. Here's where we are in the U.S. right now. We've had we're running at more than 150,000 cases a day still. We've had more than 41 million reported. We're also running at well more than 1,000 deaths per day, and this is the same number of deaths as occurred in 1918 and 1919 from the influenza outbreak. Here in California, we've done somewhat better. We've weathered this storm a little bit better, and are turning down. You can see. But we're still running at more than 10,000 cases a day in California. These are, I'll show you where they are in California in a second, but it's pretty widely dispersed. We also have come off of hospitalizations. Hospitalizations are a real problem in parts of the country. I'll touch on that in a second. But you see the shape of these curves, right? Here's what happened in the United Kingdom. They had this is all from the Delta variant. It went up, it went down. They let all the brakes, they took their foot off the brake, and all it came right back. Okay. So that's what I'm worried about, whether this starts starting to represent a rebound, whether we could potentially even rebound here in California. I think it's more likely in the rest of the country than it is here. And I will point out that 66% of the entire population of the United Kingdom is fully vaccinated, whereas in the US it's 54%. So this is happening with another quarter as many people fully vaccinated. This is where the action is. This is where the daily cases per 100,000 in the past week by county. Don't worry about Nebraska; they just don't report. And you can see how it's here through the South. It's kind of migrated north, and it's sort of here in the lower Midwest and Mid-South. But it's also out here in the Intermountain West. It's been a real mess here from all the way from South Dakota across through into Eastern Oregon and Northeastern California. In fact, there's so many spillover cases from transports from Idaho and Montana that all the hospital ICU beds are filled up in Spokane right now, even though which represents these cross-state transports. Hawaii, however, looks pretty good. There you go. And this is ICU utilization in the United States by catchment area of the ICUs. This is the red dots are more than 95% of capacity is being used up. This is in July, and this is now. And you can see how this has just brutalized the ICU systems across the South and here in the Intermountain West. And even here in California where people are getting referred in. So there are situations now. There was a horrible story about a guy who had a completely unrelated to COVID, had cardiac disease and needed to be in the ICU for an ablation or some sort of procedure in Alabama, and they couldn't find a bed for him, and he died before they could get him to a bed, which was in, by the way, in Meridian, Mississippi. So that's how tight the ICU space is in the Southeast. Here in California, the cases are, if you look at how many, where the cases are currently occurring in Los Angeles, obviously, because it's the biggest county and it has the most cases. But we've also seen a shift in these per capita numbers to the sort of the north and the east of California and down into the Central Valley, King County, Sierra County, Yuba. I think that's Yuba, not Sutter. I could be wrong. Glen, Tehama, Shasta, Siskiyou, Del Norte are all up here, the kind of the loss leaders for disease. Lassen has dodged it somewhat. And then some of the others, Stanislaus down in here is showing up, and as is Mariposa. But this gives you an idea where their cases. Now, there are not a lot of people who live in these areas, with the exception of Shasta County, where Redding is. So it's not that there are, there are not thousands and thousands of cases being contributed until you get down here into Kern, which is a big county. And that takes beds up in Los Angeles. So anyway, so this is where we are right now in the Bay Area, where we've done really, really well. This is looking at the cases per 100,000. Remember what we were looking at, back here. These are cases per 100,000, 143 per 100,000, 117. These are way up here. In the Bay Area, they're here in 13, 17, 10, 11. Even the worst behaved county, Solano, is only at 20 per 100,000. This is there are a couple of other numbers that we look at. You can see that these are going down, 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 down. Everybody's going down this in the last week. Alameda with a big drop, Contra Costa with a big drop in cases, Solano with a big drop in cases, Santa Clara with a big drop in cases. The other things we look at are the so-called effective reproductive number, R sub E. What R sub E is the number of on average, the number of secondary cases that each case is associated with. We want that number to be less than 1 because that leads to gradual extinguishing. We also look at the proportion of all tests that are positive. That's a very early, and it's not the world's most perfect indicator, but it's an early indicator that will predict whether we're going to see rises in cases. And then also I put up here is the proportion of people in the entire population who've had a first dose. And you can see how high this is across the Bay Area. Marin at 81.5%, for instance, San Francisco, 79.8. The only outlier is really Solano. And Solano's had the kind of the worst performance here in terms of all these indicators. But it's a lot better than a lot of other places. And you can see that we're really seem to be on the back end drop of this of the curve here for cases. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of where we are now. Now, what are all the variants? So variants occur when mutations in the virus occur that can affect how the virus functions. Functions mechanically, functions biochemically. So the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, has a protein coat, and then has these proteins that stick out of it called spike proteins. These are what fused with cells, and these are called ACE2 receptors, and they sit on the human airway cells as well as others. So they're everywhere from the conjunctiva in your eye all the way up and down your nose and throat to down into your trachea and lungs. What happens is that if there are mutations in the spike protein, there are several things that can happen, and I'll go over them. But what we're really concerned about here is that the virus will bind more easily to the receptor. That is, it's kind of stickier, if you will, and it will be, which is reflected in a higher R sub E, you get more cases, more secondary cases per primary case. And that's a function of how efficiently the virus is transmitted. Other types of mutations can cause it to change. So it makes it harder for antibodies to recognize the spike protein. Those probably turn out to be I mean, it's important, yes, but it's not as important as the mutations that make the virus more transmissible. So this is kind of just being more and more redundant. This is the RNA here inside. This is just a picture, right? Not that this isn't a picture too. And these are the spike proteins. This is where it's coded for in the genome, right? And if enough of these, so these viruses will accumulate mutations over time, and will kind of break up into different families, which are actually called clades in virology, CLADES. And the ones that we worry about are mutations in the spike protein. Here's your trivia pursuit questions. There are 1,273 amino acids in the spike protein, which is actually a three-pronged, it's a trimer. It sort of wraps around on itself 3 times. And the part of it that sits out at the tip, which is the part that binds to the ACE2 receptor on the airway cells, is the part we worry about the most. So all viruses mutate. That's what they do. Okay. So all viruses mutate when they replicate, and mutations are dependent on the size of the genome and what it's made of. So it's RNA and DNA. We're talking about RNA viruses here. This is where the coronaviruses are. So the smaller the virus in terms of the size of the genome, the more replications. I'm sorry. The more often it will mutate. So small viruses mutate a lot. This is one of the larger viruses, and it's larger RNA viruses, and it tends to not mutate as rapidly as these guys up here. So we're gonna, so we have some. This is kind of good news here, in that they mutate relatively slowly compared to some of the other RNA viruses like HIV. Okay, and that's because it's big. It has an extra enzyme that goes down when the RNA is reproduced. It goes down and checks it, and will cut it up if it doesn't if it's not a true copy. Now that's not a perfect process, but it gives us some fidelity, and we dodge some bullets because it's not mutating as rapidly. So why do variants emerge? Well, they emerge if there's no immune pressure, so they can do whatever they want, right? They emerge in situations of high transmission, which is where all this argument comes from, that we should, instead of using the vaccine for booster doses, we should be using it in India, where there's a lot of transmission going on. They can emerge when there's super spreading events, which is where one person, instead of transmitting to 5 people, transmits to 50 people. That gives that kind of rapid replication over lots of different people can lead to more mutations. They emerge in situations in which there's no herd immunity, which we don't have yet. We're pretty close, but we don't have it yet. And the thought is that they actually really emerge from people who are immunocompromised, who can't control the virus. And so there are situations in which people who have been infected stay infected for sort of 2 weeks because their immune systems aren't working right. They're immunocompromised. And the virus, as it replicates, is continuously exposed to an ineffective immune system. So it mutates away from that. It starts to select away from those pressures. And that's where we really start to get mutations. Now, one of the places we worry about that has a lot of people who are immunocompromised is South Africa, because there's a ton of HIV, uncontrolled HIV and poorly controlled HIV in South Africa. So people, a large proportion of the population has a defective immune system. And as a result, these viruses can replicate longer and can breed resistant mutations. And then there are some issues about species crossovers. Minks clearly get infected. A whole bunch of musculid animals like ferrets and stuff get infected, but minks, there have been big outbreaks on mink farms with this, which has led to wholesale culling of minks in places like Denmark and Utah. And yes, kitty can get this as well. I don't know if you remember last year, but there was an outbreak, or there were several cases in tigers at the Bronx Zoo. And, that's because they have these same receptors on their airway cells that we do. So being a dog lover, I love to pass this bit of information along to people. So this is what this looks like. Here's this protein that's folded on itself 3 times. And that at the tip of it is something called the receptor binding domain. All right. That's what RBD stands for. And that's where this receptor protein comes in and attaches, kind of like a lock and a key into a lock. Now, the bad variants that we worry about, the ones that make transmission more efficient, aren't in the middle of the receptor binding domain. They're more around the edges of the receptor binding domain. So think of it having a key that doesn't work really well in a lock, and you take it and you file it off, file some rough edges off, and it fits great. That's kind of what's going on here. Is that the fit is tighter. It becomes a much more stable covalent bond. And clinically, that means it's more transmissible. So WHO has helpfully gone way out of its way to classify variants into 3 categories of variants of interest, variants of concern, and variants of high consequence, which we don't have any of. So we'll leave that part alone. The variants of concern. Oh, and they also renamed everything with the Greek alphabet. So variants of concern are Delta. There are 4 of them, and Delta is one of those. There's evidence of an increase in transmissibility. They also get this label if they cause more severe disease, which is not clearly apparent with Delta. A significant reduction in neutralization by antibodies generated during previous infection or vaccination. Again, a tiny bit with Delta, but not that much. And reduced effectiveness of treatments or vaccines, or diagnostic detection failures, not a problem with Delta. I mean, it's slightly less effective, but not a lot less effective. And variants of interest are those variants that emerge that have the genetic markers that are associated with these characteristics. And that's this whole long slew of Greek letters. And we're currently up to mu. Now, as Jennifer knows, I was a classics major, and I know that there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, and mu is, I think, number 12. I'd have to count on my fingers to tell you exactly. So we're sort of halfway there, and then they're going to run out of letters, and then problem solved, right? So somebody didn't think this quite far enough ahead, but we'll see what's happening. So here are the 4 variants of concern. Here's Delta. This also has this name B16172. This is all inside baseball stuff, but this emerged in India in October 2020. It became a variant of concern in May 2021. These others have largely gone away. This was British, this was South African, this was a Brazilian one, and they've largely gone away. These are the variants of interest. They have also pretty much gone away, with the exception of Lambda, which is in eastern Peru, and Mu, which is in Colombia. This has had several isolates, like 20 countries have seen isolates, but the only place it has real concentration is in Colombia. It's Colombia with an O. This is not my mistake. Colombia and it was up 100% of the isolates in Colombia. Now it's down to 50% as Delta's come in and started to squeeze it out. So Delta outcompetes the Lambda and Mu variants. And which is why, when people say, well, is there something beyond Delta? One of the things you look at is how well is it doing in a competitive atmosphere, trying to compete for the same niche to reproduce itself. And it does much better. Delta does much better than Lambda or Mu or any of the other variants of concern. I'll show you in a second here. Delta virus also has, besides these mutations in the spike protein that make this sit more cleanly and tighter, it has a couple of other features that make it a little bit less susceptible to antibodies, and also it makes it turn it has the kinetics are that it infects the cells faster. All this is truly inside baseball stuff. Sorry, I was going to get into this. And this is what, if you look down on the virus, so this is looking straight down on the receptor binding domain. These are where these mutations are that make this make the binding a little bit tighter. Yeah, let me just say 2 words here. I'm conscious of the time. As you, the most infectious disease we know is measles, which has this R sub 0, which is kind of like R sub E, but it's not. It has to do with not, if this is in the absence of anybody being immune. If everybody's not immune to measles, it has an R sub 0 of 15, meaning that you'll have 15 cases for every 1 case. It'll be transmit to 15 different people. This is why it's such a big deal when it breaks out in Disneyland. Here's the old SARS-CoV-2, which had a kind of a roughly a R naught of, sorry, it's R sub 0, but the British say R naught, so that's what we say, R naught of 3.5, and this is now more closer to 6 or so. Okay, smallpox, polio, SARS, the original SARS, Spanish flu, right? This is kind of up pushing the edge of chickenpox is probably half again more as transmissible, but measles is way out here. So this is not good news. This means it's more transmissible. So it's more infectious. You have a higher viral load. You have to read this stuff upside down. This has to do with when a test turns positive. It's called cycle time. So the cycle time for the Delta variant is lower than for the kind of the old reference strain, which means that it becomes the test becomes positive faster, which means there's more virus present, and it also you become infectious more quickly. It builds up, so it has sort of a shorter period of time, a shorter incubation period, maybe as much as a half day shorter. This is what I wanted you to see. This blue here is the Alpha variant, the British variant that we're so concerned about in the spring. Gone. Here's the green one. This is the Brazilian variant that I at least was concerned about. Vanished, right? It's all Delta now. That's what all this orange is Delta, and that's true. This is the U.S. as a whole. This is the Western region, Western Public Health Service region, Region 9, which is California, Arizona, Hawaii, Nevada, and the Pacific Territories. So this is like 95% Delta, right? I mean, 99.5% Delta. It's really squeezed everybody out. And what you can see here, and this is data from the UK, is that they had all this out. That unfortunately, the colors are flipped over here for God knows what reason, but they had all this alpha stuff this is what was causing all the big British surges, and then so this is the big British surge, and then Delta came in from India, and it just completely took over. And right, and the same thing's happening in the U.S. This chart only goes out to mid-July before we got the big surge from all Delta. So what I'm saying is that Delta has outcompeted Alpha, it's outcompeted Gamma. Beta never really entered the picture. That's a South African version. It's outcompeted all these other guys. Okay. So how does CDC recommend to deal with the Delta variant? That vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals should wear masks in public indoor areas. That is a recommendation for areas with substantial or high transmission, which includes all the Bay Area counties, at least as of this morning. That immunocompromised people should wear a mask regardless of the level of risk in the area, and that vaccinated persons exposed to someone with SARS-CoV-2 infection should be tested 3 to 5 days post-vaccination. Instead of saying, nah, you're vaccinated, you don't have to worry about it, it says you got to be retested. And then universal masking for teachers, staff, students, and visitors to school, regardless of vaccination status. This is adding an extra layer of protection above vaccination just because it's so much more transmissible. Okay, so let's talk about vaccinations. Currently, we've given 47.1 million doses in California. There was a big surge back here in the spring and early summer, which tapered off, and now it's come back up again as people get, as the as the restrictions start to go into place and people are now being more or less cajoled, forced, whatever the best word is, into being vaccinated. The 8 Bay Area counties minus Solano, that never shows up on these lists. These are the most vaccinated counties in California. If you look at people who are fully vaccinated, I showed you the first dose. I showed you these data before. Here are the proportion that are fully vaccinated. It's everything from 75.8% in Marin to 74.9%, 73.9% in San Francisco, and down here in Alameda, it's 69.5%. That's of everybody, including people who are ineligible for vaccination. So we're doing pretty well. We've given mostly Moderna and Pfizer, only about 7% is Johnson & Johnson. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later too. This is a score that goes into it defines healthcare utilization, poverty, educational attainment, things like that. The lowest quartile, which are the poorest neighborhoods, 42% of the population remains to be vaccinated, which is pretty good. It means 58% has been vaccinated, right? Or fully or partially vaccinated. And that shrinks to 23%, which is the highest health score quartile, which would be like a place like Piedmont or Atherton. Here's Alameda County. Alameda County actually has a pretty good dashboard. You can pull data out of this pretty easily. And this is looking at doses by age group. So 80% of 12 to 15-year-olds and 82.7% of 16 to 17-year-olds in Alameda County have been vaccinated, right? Have received at least one vaccine, which I think is really high. It's actually 90% in San Francisco. These are all the kids in high schools and stuff. So we need to push on this. We need to get this up, but it's coming. It's a lot better than it is in 18 to 34-year-olds who are like, hopeless about getting vaccinated. And even here among the oldest people, only 83% are fully vaccinated. If you look by race and ethnicity and population, this is the percent of the population 12 years old or older. So this is just of the total population. This is 12 years old and older. You can see that it's there's some lags in African American populations, but it's pretty well across other racial and ethnic groups. It's not that much different. In San Francisco, African American and Black and whites have the same level of vaccination. Oh, and Piedmont down here has 97.5% who've gotten one dose and 89% who are fully vaccinated. That's far and away the most in Alameda County. Now, how well does the vaccine work? These are, this is looking out here. See, there's the numbers for Pfizer for 65 to 74-year-olds, for Pfizer for 75 and older, for Moderna, the same thing, and then the Johnson & Johnson. And this is also for partially vaccinated people. So this is looking at older people. And you can see we get pretty high levels here. I think this is backwards. I think this is 91%. This is 96%. But you can see how it's really working pretty well. But there is a 10 percentage point difference between how well these vaccines perform and how well the J&J vaccine performs. So bear that in mind as we go forward here. Despite the fact that the vaccines work really well, we have breakthrough cases where vaccinated people do get infected, fully vaccinated people. This is looking at Los Angeles from May to through the end of July. So it's getting the kind of the first part of Delta. And during this period of time, if you were unvaccinated, you're 4.9 times more likely to be diagnosed with SARS and reported with SARS-CoV-2. And you're 29.4 times more likely to be hospitalized with SARS-CoV-2. Actually, some of the counties, Contra Costa in particular, puts these data out on a daily basis for their cases. Now, why do we have vaccine failures? Well, the most likely, so about 5%, so keep this number in mind, about 5% of people fail vaccination. Why do they fail? The most common reason is mishandling of the vaccine. The mRNA vaccines have to be kept really cold. And if you let them heat up, you're going to get into trouble. And it's going to be like injecting sterile water. People who are immunocompromised, people who are on certain therapeutic Agents may not seroconvert quite as quickly, and we'll come back to this group here. You could have genetic drift, and the variants could actually be more resistant to the vaccine. And then the other thing that's been a lot in the news is whether immunity wanes over time. But remember, for every one case of vaccine failure, there are 20 cases of people who get infected because they failed to get vaccinated. So this is far and away the larger problem. The other thing is just from a probabilistic standpoint, the greater the proportion of the population that's vaccinated, the greater the proportion, not number, but the proportion of cases that are in people who are fully vaccinated will be. So if you have a population in which 100% of people are vaccinated, all the cases you're going to see are vaccine failures. And there's a kind of an algorithm. This is working it with a relative risk of 7.5. But you can see that, we're here kind of in this range in California. So it's not at all surprising that 20, 25, 30% of cases may be among people who have failed vaccination. There is also evidence for waning immunity post-vaccination. These are data from 8 US locations, and you can see here that in the period of time where Delta was predominant, the vaccine effectiveness, which is how well it works, and I can explain how it's calculated, was only 66%, and that had dropped off substantially compared to the pre-Delta period of time. So this is one of these things that have led CDC and people to worry about it. The other thing is there's a lot of Israeli data that float around that have been, sort of largely unpublished and are not, they're kind of the quality of the data is probably okay, but nobody's totally sure. This is data about Israel's been adding offering a third dose to people, starting with the older people. And here's what they're estimating how much booster protection they're getting against confirmed infection and against severe disease. You get out 12 and a half days out, you're 11.4 times less likely to develop severe disease than if you've only had 2 doses. So they're pretty convinced that it's time to give everybody booster doses. The CDC's advisory committee is going to hear this thing once and for all on Friday, and should have clear recommendations in. But for right now, the U.S. is considering recommending a third dose. So there are 2 issues. One is the fact that there are certain people who are immunocompromised or taking certain types of drugs who are not getting developing immunity at the same rate. And the other is this problem is immunity sort of tailing off in the face of Delta infection. So right now, there's a current recommendation that if you've had a solid organ transplant or immunosuppressed on hemodialysis, taking certain drugs that are immunosuppressive for rheumatologic disease, say, that you should get a third dose right now. These people may actually need a 4th dose at some point in time. And then for everybody else, because of this concern about waning immunity, there's supposed to be a recommendation to add a third dose for everyone starting on September 20th, which I will point out is Monday. So the clock's ticking on this one. It'll be done in sort of in the same order that we gave vaccine in the first place to long-term care facility residents and healthcare workers, then to adults over 75 and frontline workers, then adults over 65, and then adults with 16 to 64 with certain high-risk medical conditions, and on and on and on. And there's an active discussion of whether this should be just done for the Pfizer vaccine, which is where all the data or should be also done for Moderna. So the only thing to say here is stay tuned. And J&J is this is another whole issue, and I could talk about it if people are interested. So where are we now with schools? Schools prevention strategies are vaccination for people who are eligible, which includes teachers, students, parents, and SIBs, older SIBs. Consistent and correct mask use, screening, which is used more. In some school districts use it a lot, others use it less. Distancing, which is somewhat less important with masking. Increasing ventilation, staying home when symptomatic, hugely important. Contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine, and I can speak to modified quarantine as well. And then also less important, cleaning, disinfection, and hand washing. Adolescent vaccination coverage, this is through the end of July in California, wasn't great. It's actually really good in the Bay Area. But just to show you how much better it is in California than in Nevada or in the country as a whole. And this is also at the end of July. We're now halfway through September, so we're 45 days later, and all these numbers have come way up since then. Now, it's also problematic. I don't know if you heard about this, but there was an outbreak in May in a school in Marin. Marin had been open all last year. The Marin schools were open all last year with maybe 4 or 5 cases. But a teacher, an unvaccinated teacher, came to school and taught for 3 days or 2 days, and infected 12 kids in their class who went home and infected more people. And this is what really kind of pushed all the buttons at the state level about requiring vaccination for teachers, or if not vaccination, then frequent testing. Now, how do we keep safe in the era of the Delta variant? So we have the rise of this much more transmissible Delta variant. It's now almost all the isolates in the US. Our problem is failure to vaccinate. It's not vaccine failure. That vaccine failure is a nuance. It's a fringe issue. The core issue is failure to vaccinate. And we continue to have mixing of unvaccinated people with resultant transmission. Also, there's less than full adherence to non-pharmaceutical interventions like masks among both vaccinated and unvaccinated people. So if you are a vaccinated person and you have a mask and you don't have a mask on, and you come into contact with someone who's infectious, if you're one of the 1 in 20 people who don't have a take for the vaccine, for whom the vaccine didn't work, you're going to get infected. So that's what we're seeing. So that's what the masks are meant to do, to provide an extra layer of protection. We have this problem of failure to develop immunity in some immunocompromised individuals. That's going to be addressed by adding a 3rd dose, right? That's going on right now. And there's some evidence of declining vaccine effectiveness that's temporarily associated with the rise of the Delta virus, which some people interpret as waning immunity. Some people worry about escape mutations, but the bottom line is that they're breakthrough infections, and that's going to be addressed with this booster dose. So President Biden stepped into this believe it was Thursday. A long speech. I can't imagine how somebody could give a speech that long. My message to unvaccinated Americans is this: what more is there to wait for? What more do you need to see? We've made vaccinations free, safe, and convenient. The vaccine is FDA approved. Over 200 million Americans have gotten at least 1 shot. We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin. You and your refusal has cost all of us. And so he outlined the 6-point plan, which is to require vaccination of all employers, for all employers with 100 employees or more, all executive branch employees, and employees of all federal contractors. He reiterated that they would make booster doses available. There are a lot of provisions for protecting school children, but they stopped short of mandating vaccination in schools. There was provisions made for increased testing and masking, with a lot more production of testing kits, to expand the COVID-19 economic injury disaster loans, which are to help businesses stabilize that have been affected by COVID-19. And they're also making military, medical, and nursing teams available to ICU staff in some of these highly impacted southern hospitals, and also are taking over the distribution of the really good therapeutic agent we have, which are monoclonal antibodies. So this happened, and then the next day, the Los Angeles Unified School District mandated student vaccines as well. That has not yet happened at any school district up here, to my knowledge, although I know Santa Clara is looking at it quite seriously. So how can you decrease your risk of acquiring and transmitting the Delta variant? If you're not vaccinated, get vaccinated. And then get your 5 to 11-year-olds vaccinated as soon as possible, following the authorization of the vaccine, which will probably be in October. If you're immunocompromised or have had a solid organ transplant or on some of these drugs, get a 3rd dose of vaccine right away. Don't wait around for that. Just make it happen. And otherwise, you await the further recommendations. By await, I mean 2 days, regarding boosters. Wear masks in indoor public places, wear masks outdoors if in large crowds. And yes, that includes the baseball games. Avoid mixing with unvaccinated people unless you're masked. And if you're exposed or symptomatic, get tested. So with that, wagging my finger at you, telling you what to do, I'm happy to stop and answer questions, Jennifer.
All right, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to group them in categories a little bit, and I'm hoping maybe you can stay a few minutes later if we don't quite get through everything. So I want to start with community gatherings. We see on TV a lot of people gathering, especially with football season starting up, in crowds, often without masks. I think locally we're not seeing that quite as much. But what is the risk for us gathering here in our communities, and specifically just in general, what is that risk and what precautions should we be taking or requiring of the people around us? And specifically in like churches and synagogues where singing is very important to people, how does singing affect that? And should there be special considerations in that situation?
Sure. So I think the simple, so you have sort of have two choices for these large outdoor well, you have three choices. One is you pay no attention to any of this stuff. That's one. That's Cal football stadium, right? And Jennifer knows I went to Stanford, so we're going to be mean about Cal here. The second thing, you can require people to prove that they're vaccinated and then say they don't have to wear masks if they come in. And the third thing is that you require people to wear masks. And I think that's probably where we should be coming. That's what I would do, requiring people to wear masks. And if you can prove vaccination too, that's even better. But, those are sort of your two choices. You prove you're vaccinated or you wear masks for outdoor events. See, outdoors is good because it gets away from aerosol transmission where particles remain up in suspension in the air. But it doesn't, if somebody's standing a foot away from you and coughs in your face, being outdoors isn't going to protect you at all. So you need to be, I plan to go to as many football games as I can, not 49ers, but go to as many Stanford games as I can. And I'm going to wear a mask in the stadium. I'm going to try and model good behavior. Now, churches and synagogues, singing is highly problematic. So Jennifer got me into one of the greatest gigs of my adult life, which is advising the San Francisco Opera about how to go back to get back into the War Memorial Opera House, where you bring in, people from Italy, where it was like hugely endemic, and have them stand on the edge of the stage and spit on 75-year-olds. So, it's you can't imagine sort of a worse, series of events. They follow really tight guidelines, and they require everybody to be vaccinated, and they screen them heavily if they're singing. I don't see churches and synagogues doing this. And I would say that that you probably should give up singing until we get this under control. Or if an individual, the priest or cantor or whoever's going to sing, that they have to be way socially distanced from everyone else. Again, if it's indoors, people should be wearing masks. But you have to take it really easy. This is not the time to push the envelope. And I'll draw your eyes again to what happened in Britain, where there was that saddle and it went down and it went right back up. So don't rest on our laurels quite yet.
What if everyone was wearing masks while singing? Because, in the opera, obviously the professional singers are not wearing masks. In a church, you can have your congregation wearing masks.
Yeah, you can wear masks and sing, but don't push it. Just don't push it. You can read the hymns.
So we have lots of questions about schools, and I want to tie it in a little bit also to testing. So I know in Piedmont, the schools are requiring masks both indoors and outdoors, but I can't attest to how good they are at enforcing the mask wearing, especially for younger kids. How important is it, like mask wearing versus keeping doors open, having fans running, the spacing of the desks?
Yeah, mask wearing,
cleaning, using cleaning equipment on all of the surfaces.
It's mask wearing is the most important thing. You can, in the absence of vaccination, which you can do for older kids, mask wearing is the most important thing. And it's far and away more important than all the cleaning stuff you can do. And kids are quite good again about wearing masks. My wife always loves the story that we had our 3.5-year-old granddaughter with us in Honolulu, in Hawaii. And, she would wear a mask everywhere outdoors, no problem, but she wouldn't wear underwear. Right. So it's that kind of, it's just so ingrained. The other, but it's some of the trick is, what do you do at lunch? Right. And some of the school districts are saying lunch is only 14 minutes long because the definition of close contact is 15 minutes, which is probably a bit bogus. But I think for lunch, it's probably makes sense to cohort kids together so that you have small groups who are the same small groups all the time. So if somebody gets sick, the quarantine doesn't get too out of control. So there are lots of things, but I think vaccination is far and away the most important. Vaccination of teachers is hugely important. And then at the next level out, masks, and the next level out, social distancing. And ventilation's fine, but ventilation's going to help, but it's not an end all and be all.
Okay. So how does testing tie into that equation? So if you, especially for the younger kids who can't get vaccinated now, I mean, the teachers can, but the younger kids can't, should there be some sort of systematic testing of the kids, and how regular would that need to be effective? And is that even a viable option?
Well, Los Angeles is doing it that way, with how resilient kids go to in Los Angeles Unified School District. They fly a plane up every night with all the tests in it, and they run them overnight in Brisbane and then send the results back down. It's one way to do it. And I would tend to, for right now, I think we're going to see new guidelines around testing because it's part of the Biden initiative, the newer Biden initiative. But I think that it's going to be, right now, probably not enough tests on the market to be able to do it if you wanted to. And so it's, I think that it should be used for people who are symptomatic to rule out disease so they can go to school. And also people who have been exposed and are in so-called modified quarantine, where they can continue to go to school, but just get tested because when they were exposed, they had their mask on. I think those are the major, and for teachers who haven't gotten vaccinated, those are the major uses I see. And then if you're going to escalate, you have to escalate way beyond that. Then you have to start testing the kids once or twice a week, depending on what kind of testing systems you're using to assure, and you have to test everybody. This isn't some random sample. You have to do everybody if you're going to do it that way. It becomes a much bigger deal.
Yeah, it seems like a bit of a logistical nightmare. Given that the Delta variant, so sticking on tests for a little while, the Delta variant has the higher viral load, does that make the testing more accurate? So are tests more reliable now than they were, say, a year ago?
Yeah, they're about the same. They're pretty reliable.
Okay.
I mean, some of them are extremely reliable to the point that they'll detect somebody who was infected 2 weeks ago and, cause all sorts of unnecessary, flailing. But it's, but they're good.
And is that are you talking about the PCR test mostly,
Yeah.
or and how is the rapid testing, and is rapid testing something that's being developed so that we can use it more effectively, like for personal use or maybe in schools and things like that?
So there are two types of tests. Well, there are a bazillion types of tests. One test for nucleic acid, test for RNA, that's PCR, LAMP. There are several different test systems, but PCR is the one that people typically use. That's highly accurate. It's also pretty laboratory intensive. There are home test kits, but they've really been all bought up. This is what the Warriors use, by the way. Then the other thing you test is for protein, viral protein. Those are called antigen tests. And those are things like Binax Now and Quidel. Those can be done at point of care. They don't have to go to a laboratory to be done. And they're rapid tests. And the Binax test, the antigen test, will detect people who are infectious at that moment in time. They might miss a few on the early end, but if they're positive, they're really positive. And that's what I would prefer to see used to rule out disease in children who are symptomatic, for instance, as they come into school. Now, there are a lot of rules about this, and what I want to do may not be the same as the rules because I know more than the people who make the rules. But anyway, be that as it may. So.
Can you speak briefly about traveling and your recommendations for traveling and whether the sort of considerations should be different for domestic versus international? And also, if that relates at all to how far away you are from when you got vaccinated.
Yeah, so those are all good questions. So by and large, I think travel is safe. It all depends on where you're going. Understand going to Florida is like going into the, the seventh ring of hell in terms of COVID virus transmission. So just because it's domestic doesn't mean that it's necessarily good. And just because it's international doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. But you have to know what's going on in the countries you're planning on traveling to, because they'll quarantine you if you get positive, and you're going to be stuck in some crummy airport hotel at Heathrow for 2 weeks, eating, British hotel food and, on a tray at your own expense, by the way. So that you can be, you need to be careful about that stuff. I have one of my nephews just went on a trip to South Africa. He had a great time, pictures and stuff, no problem. But you got to understand what you're getting yourself into. And then, the plane flights, everybody's, the airlines are requiring everybody to get all their crews to be vaccinated. Everybody has to wear masks. That's heavily enforced. And the only real outbreaks we've seen on planes we're early on, and they're on really long haul planes, like from London to Singapore, or Beijing or something, 17-hour flights. And there's no place you can fly from here for 17 hours that will have you. Australia you can't go to, New Zealand you can't go to, Singapore you can go to, but it's you'd be careful about what you're getting into on the other end.
Okay, so I want to we have a ton of questions about boosters.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll start with, can you mix and match booster shots?
Yeah, but don't do it. Probably you can, but don't do it. Just if you got Moderna, stick with Moderna. If you got Pfizer, stick with Pfizer. That's what we're going to know. That's what the recommendations are going to say. And they'll say if it's dire straits, if they've completely run out of one, you can mix and match, but don't do it preferentially. The trick is with J&J, right? Because there's a trial in the field right now that's looking at 1 versus 2 doses of J&J. So, but I don't know the answer about whether you should get 2 doses of J&J yet. It may not be any better than 1. I would think it would be, but I don't know that as a fact. In England and in other parts of Europe, where they used a lot of AstraZeneca vaccine, which is the same technology as the J&J vaccine. It's an adenovirus to get the RNA into the cell. They started to boost with Pfizer, so they were mixing the adenovirus with the mRNA vaccines, and there's literature on that says it's quite effective. So. I don't know what CDC is going to recommend. They may not touch the J&J thing and wait for the J&J trial to finish, but I can tell you San Francisco Department of Public Health says that if anybody has a J&J vaccine and they have a reason to need to get boosted, they'll give them an mRNA vaccine, which is totally off label, by the way, and open yourself up for all sorts of little problems with the legal profession, potentially.
What about if you had the Johnson & Johnson and then getting a full series of an mRNA vaccine instead of just a booster?
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, I'd wait and see. You have high levels of protection from J&J. You're gilding the lily here.
There's been talk about the flu season being particularly bad this year.
Yeah.
And how does getting a flu shot correlate at all with getting a booster shot for COVID? Is that something that people should worry about as far as the timing of those?
No, you can give them both at the same time. Give them in different arms, but you give them at the same time. You should absolutely get a flu shot. We had almost no flu last year, almost none. And we don't have any idea what's going to happen this year. There's some Southern Hemisphere data that looks like flu might have bumped last year. So we have to be careful about it. So definitely get your flu shot. As well as if you're going to get a booster, get the booster. If not, but for God's sakes, get your flu shot too.
All right. So I think we've covered most of that. So for the data that you shared on case rates, is the higher case rates in some areas of the world mostly because of availability of testing, or are there some other factors in the data that are?
Yeah, I mean, in India, God knows what's going on in the interior of it, in poor India and states like Bihar and stuff. It's, you don't really know what's going on there at all. But, it's what's reported. And, that's what WHO picks up. It could have to do with how it will be kind of roughly, the trends will be roughly interpretable. And if there's spikes, it means there's a lot of transmission going on. The reason there's a lot of transmission going on is there are a lot of non-immune people in the face of a very, very transmissible organism. So yeah, it's a function of not having vaccine, but it's also a function of, of people not, if they'd had an outbreak already, they would have a probably lower level of disease from naturally acquired immunity.
With us in the Bay Area, where we have a fairly high vaccine rate, I mean, you said the main issue is the rate of vaccination.
Right.
How does that really apply to us? Like, can we let our guard down at all with the rates that we're still at?
No. To start with, people move. Okay. So, this is not an island. It's not like doing this on Maui. It's an island. It's not an island, and people come in and out of it all the time. So I think we need to consider the Bay Area as a whole, rather than as in isolated counties or isolated cities. It's not like you can achieve herd immunity in one corner of the herd, but not in the other. It's about the entire population, and that probably includes Santa Cruz and Monterey too, who do pretty well, by the way. So you have to take kind of a bigger view of this stuff. Now, we're a lot better off than a lot of places. Vermont may be a little better off than we are, but it's not the time to let your guard down. But we'll get there eventually. But we're going to have to get pediatric vaccines to get the proportion up high enough.
Do you have any intel about the pediatric vaccines?
Yes, I have lots. The study should close out next week. The data submitted to the FDA the week after, and we assume that they're going to hear the FDA is going to do what FDA is going to do, but we assume that this will be heard and with an emergency use authorization granted sometime in early October.
That's coming
but
right
for
up.
Kids under 5, it's going to take longer. It's going to take more like to the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. Can you clarify a little bit about vaccine mandates and how those relate with testing also? So if a school is mandating vaccines, but then requiring, you only need to get tested once a week if you're not vaccinated.
Yeah, they're different things. So schools have mandated vaccines, which is Los Angeles, by the way, and Culver City are the two that I know of that have mandated. They're saying if you're not fully vaccinated, you have to be homeschooled, which is what the law is currently for everything else, right? For other required vaccines. And there's a lead-in period. You have so much time to get it, and when you turn 12, then blah blah. So that's one thing. That's one disease control strategy. A separate disease control strategy is to test people frequently and to find people to exclude them, and to isolate them, to remove them from the herd, the flock, the population, so they don't infect other people. That's a bit of a, that can work as well, but it's just the logistics of it are just terrifying, I think. And then the question is how frequently should you test them? With the kinds of exposure these kids have, you should probably be testing them twice a week. Right now, you're looking at kind of once a week, unless they're in certain high risk things.
All right, we're about 5 minutes over time. I have one sort of really general question that I would like to wrap up with.
Yeah,
which
sure.
is, are we ever going to get to some kind of life that looks similar to it did before March of 2020?
Yeah, but we're still going to have this around. This will continue for 10 years from now. This will be part of the regular pediatric vaccination series. And you go to college or go to elementary school or whatever. But it'll continue to pop up as a cause of community acquired pneumonia every once in a while. I don't think it's going to exist at the levels we have now. There's way too much immunity in the population for it to really exist like that, but it'll perk along, and it may continue to evolve in a way that makes it even less virulent than it is now.
All right, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know all of our community members appreciate it. Jennifer, do you want to say anything in closing?
Oh, just wanted to thank you so much for your time, George. We always learn so much, and we really appreciate particularly being able to ask our very specific questions. So thank you so much for being with us again.
You're welcome. It's a real pleasure. Take care, everybody.